Good morning and welcome to Teen Ypww, Lesson 6, God's Righteousness versus Self-Righteousness. The lesson text is found in Romans chapter 10, verses 1 through 9. Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. For I bear them record that they have a zeal of God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law, for righteousness to everyone that believeth. For Moses describeth the righteousness which is of the law, that the man which doeth those things shall live by them. But the righteousness which is of faith speaketh on this wise: Say not in thine heart, Who shall ascend into heaven? That is, to bring Christ down from above. Or who shall descend into the deep? That is, to bring up Christ again from the dead. But what saith it? The word is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thy heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. That if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. So the text reads here, For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted themselves unto the righteousness of God. And that's Romans chapter 10, verse 3. The key is being righteous among the unrighteous. Today's focus, preparing students to define and defend God's righteousness. Your definition of right, my definition of right, being right or wrong, can be confusing, depending on the subject we discuss. In my home, it is imperative that I have an advanced weekly schedule for my 2 teenage daughters with their school activities, my work activities, and our church activities. It is essential that I know every Monday morning the upcoming activity flow for our week. All requests for participation in activities must be made in advance. The question, can I go to this event tomorrow, is generally unacceptable. However, the question, can I go to this event next week, is an acceptable question for my consideration. This is my definition of the right notification for event participation. Around the world, organizations have variances of practices and protocols for every event, while every home and business has degrees of freedom to define right practices. There are standards that all groups must follow to operate legally and effectively. God has a standard of righteousness that all believers around the world should embrace and follow. Unfortunately, some religions have established their standards of righteousness based on error and lies. These groups disregard the righteousness of God as given in His Word. Our memory verse shares that there are 2 types of righteousness in the religious circles of the world: God's righteousness and self-righteousness. It is our duty, teen reader, to seek and find out what is the righteousness of God. By doing so, we will in turn be blessed by God. There is a standard for God's righteousness that all believers should embrace. There are many scriptures that will help us learn what God's righteousness is and is not. It is still a battle of good versus evil. Being self-righteous is a way for some people to maintain a lifestyle of being righteous in their own opinions. They justify their self-righteous lifestyle under the banner of Jesus knows and forgives our pre-planned sinful acts before we commit them. It's all good. They say, because all have sinned and have come short of the glory of God. However, the grace of God is not a license for you to continue like and boast about the sinful acts you have committed or plan to commit in the future. We are not saying that believers will never make mistakes and fall short of the glory of God. That is not the message of this lesson. When believers make a mistake or commit a sinful act, They are sorrowful and repentant. They strive never to make that mistake again. They are saddened by their error. Believers who live submitted lives to the will of God don't make plans to continue in sin. God forbid. A believer who walks after the Spirit of God and not after the flesh does not like sin because they know that God hates sin. They work hard to remove all influences and opportunities to sin out of their lives. The comparative chart. Students will discuss the difference between the righteousness of God and self-righteousness. Some religious groups have a form of godliness but not a heart to live by the standards of God's righteousness. Students will have the opportunity to compare and contrast these two systems of beliefs. We learn more about the righteousness of God by rightly dividing His word of truth. Students will be encouraged and strengthened in their walk with God. The first question is, what are some ways we can walk after the Spirit and not after the flesh? So these are personal questions for you. So write them down in your journal and then answer it. The next one says, share with the class a habit or practice that you have that helps you to walk in the Spirit every day. God bless you and thank you for joining me today.